Welcome to the K2 Sales Podcast. I'm your host, Karen Kelly. Every week, I'll be sitting down with a sales executive where they'll share their stories and experiences that produce game-changing results. Let's be honest, sales can be a tough game. I'm sure at some point, we've all delivered a less than stellar demo, been ghosted by a client or two, and sometimes maybe we did more talking than listening. And that's where I can help. The stories and insights our guests share can be applied to your own business, your territory, or with your team, so you're not reinventing the wheel. Our weekly tactics and strategies help you get out of your head and start creating your own path towards game-changing results. So the pandemic brought a lot of uncertainty, and it still remains. And in 2021, a lot of sales reps may be feeling that they could be replaced by robots or AI plays a big role, and they may be a little fearful. And what I would say is some sales reps who are underperforming and really not investing in sales for the right reasons, that may be true. But for sales reps who are taking the approach, they're developing themselves, they're upskilling, and they're truly vested in helping their customers, I think those people will be fine. But to better answer these questions and really show us how AI can support us as salespeople, teams, and overall company culture, I'm excited to present Brian Lenahan to the podcast. Brian is an AI specialist. He's an MIT graduate. He's an author of 4 books on AI and much, much more. So, Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Karen. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. So, Brian, why don't we just start by giving us a little context? And, you didn't land in AI. Obviously, there was some lead up. So, maybe just give us some background as to what got you to where you are today and perhaps a little bit about your company.
So, I would say I'm probably one of the examples of the people who transform their careers. I, lived a 25 odd year career in the financial services industry and loved what I was doing there. But fortunately, I had the opportunity to retire early. And when you retire early, you have this sort of, doors that you need to think about. And for me, it was really about all of the IT projects that I had been involved in financial services and where I was the business lead and I could connect with the IT teams. And one of the last projects that I was involved with was in financial crimes and fraud management, where we were using large amounts of data to try to be better at predicting how our customers were being impacted by fraud and how we could stop that before it actually happens. And so those were some of the challenges, but you can imagine with that large amount of data, we needed a way to analyze it. And it wasn't through traditional computing. We had to use things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to really draw some insights in order for us to be better at predicting those situations. And so when I left the bank, I needed to think about where IT was really trending. And that, for me, it was very exciting thinking about artificial intelligence. And 4 years ago, that was a fairly immature type of technology. The leading university at that time was MIT. So I thought I would go to that program and really learn about how AI could be applied and integrated into companies. And since then, Karen, it's been a fantastic journey working with large corporates and scaling companies, uh, thinking about how they can implement AI and without it just simply being the shiny object. It has to be something that's valuable. And always remember, of course, that it's a tool. It doesn't necessarily replace all of those sort of very important human elements that we need to consider. So, that's my journey over the last number of years. And certainly artificial intelligence has already done some very exciting things and has some exciting things to do in the future.
What a journey. Lots of exciting things from the bank to where you're at today. And I'm sure if we have this conversation a year from now, there'll be tons of change as well. It's just continually growing. So it is a tool, which I would agree with. And I like that, just based on how I introduce it, people, there might be some fear that they're going to be replaced. And, the way I'd like to have this conversation is even if you think about sales as, the art and the science, and science is the AI or the process driven. But I still feel, obviously, I'm a salesperson, but there's still room for that human connection, the empathy, the things that Alexa can't do. So, in terms of the flow of how we're going to talk today, I would like to just, if you would start by kind of very high level, like breaking down like AI to the layman person, because we hear so much about it. And I just think it might be helpful if we started there. And then maybe if you shared some breakthroughs that are on the horizon, again, for those not in the field as close as you are, this is going to be very new for us and what's already here. And then we can just look at like specifically to sales. So, what problems people that are adopting or companies AI, what problems are they looking to solve? Or what efficiencies they're trying to gain? And then just really how can it, improve. I always look at things from the buyer's journey. So there's a lot of tools out there that can really almost validate our approach, whether it's messaging, whether it's, intent, all these things. So I'd like to go there. So that's just very, high level where we'd like to go. But if you wouldn't mind starting just in very layman terms, what is AI?
Sure. So, AI or artificial intelligence is the attempt to mimic the human brain. The human brain has the ability to think and conceptualize and put things in sort of context. So, a traditional computer is very good at collecting and summarizing and reporting on data. But artificial intelligence allows the computer, just using an algorithm or various algorithms, to be able to create insights that we would not otherwise be able to gather because there's so much information. So, take for example a picture. So, if I'm looking at a picture, it's made up of pixels. The traditional computer can tell you whether it's a red or a yellow pixel. But using artificial intelligence and machine learning, so the algorithms that go along with it, that computer is able to say, that is a girl playing with a ball in a park. So it's actually able to, once you train that computer with all sorts of similar kinds of images, it starts to realize that I understand what's going on in that picture in context. One of the original challenges that artificial intelligence had was differentiating the accuracy level of what was in those pictures. So, for example, you would show the computer a picture of a chihuahua and it would think it was a blueberry muffin. So, those accuracy issues really had to come along in the last few years. The same thing is true with senses. A lot of what happens today, if larger companies are looking at their blogs or reviews or data that's coming through their company social media, rather than having someone individual take a look at those comments, using artificial intelligence and something called natural language processing, just like it sounds, how to take text and make meaning of it, but in large amounts, they can do sentiment analysis. So let's say, for example, you've put out a new brand and you're looking for feedback. Rather than having individuals sift through that information, the more value add activity is if the computer sifts through all that information, makes meaning of it, and passes it on to people to make decisions. And this is one of the big differences here that we're going to be talking about today is that as long as human beings or buyers are making decisions, making those buying decisions or making other decisions, it's important that we see this as a tool, simply enabling people to make better decisions and make better actions.
And for those once they kind of disseminate all that information, I would imagine the accuracy is getting better and better with time. And is there a gap or a streamlined process to pass on to the humans to make the humans to make the decision? Like, where is there a transition there? Because it seems like it goes very, computer driven and scaling a large amount of information to a decision. So if they've made an error or it's not accurate, like the Chihuahua to the blueberry, that could be catastrophic to the, what they're trying to achieve in terms of a blog. So is there a process there, or could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you a perfect example where lots of companies who have tried to use artificial intelligence are basing it on bad data, information that was
Mm.
either incorrect, improperly structured, or tagged. And so it's difficult to use what they call garbage in and garbage out. So, you're a salesperson, you're relying on information coming out of a system and you're hoping that the input is absolutely correct. So that's one part, the errors. The second part is bias, where you've got data that is heavily biased towards maybe a gender or a geography or a type of product, and therefore the insights that the algorithm using that data is making is going to be heavily weighted towards those things and therefore not reality. And so, what I would tell you also is that a significant amount of work has been done in the last few years around correcting for that bias, correcting for those errors, and even going one layer above with ethics and responsibility. One of the examples that I quite often use is um, in one of the large corporations, they decided that they would use past history to derive the algorithm for succession planning. And when they started sifting through the data, the resumes that were being applied to that algorithm, guess what was happening? They were immediately taking women out of the filter because in the past, it had been mostly men in this organization who had succeeded to the higher levels. Well, you can imagine it's so critical. And I think I recently wrote an article or a blog post about diversity. So important to have a diverse group of people involved in the origination of any of these algorithms. Diversity from gender, from work experience, from background, etc.
I never would have even thought that obviously date errors, but bias is huge. And you think about, diversity and inclusion now, and how can you ensure that there's still, is there another screening layer to make sure that there's inclusivity, just to kind of validate that decision before launching it? Because you think about, and this is another topic, but even women in sales, and if they're being underrepresented, or they're not, like past behaviors don't necessarily predict future behaviors, and just what layer of protection do you have to make sure that you're really addressing biases? Because I could see how there'd be a lot of backlash if this wasn't really addressed.
Yeah, and it really comes at the C-suite level where they have to feel comfortable that what is being produced isn't simply a black box, a whole series of things that nobody really understands and that you simply get an output from. So it's absolutely critical that um, the organizations that are being successful are using templates, are using checklists, are using uh, the sort of a chief ethics officer, or someone who is actually driving that kind of um, uh, the discipline. Maybe it's a compliance officer or something like that, or chief data officer. But having a role or several roles that ensures that those steps have been taken in designing the algorithms. So you mentioned, for example, women in sales. If, for example, you're building an algorithm that's using certain type of behaviors on the part of the customer or on behalf of the salesperson, and there are differences from a gender perspective, and that's not being captured, then if you put someone through a training program using that capability, you're eventually going to be teaching the wrong behaviors.
Wow, that totally makes sense. And it just, as you were saying that, it made me think about buyer personas, because I imagine people would want to get very granular as to, what's important to them, what motivates them, what's the risk of doing nothing, what influence, all these things. And if you get it wrong, like that carries downstream and everything else is wrong. So it seems like when you're adopting this tool, it's systemic. Like you have to, there's got to be a level of preparedness. The culture has to embrace it, because it sounds like it's got a lot of reach, and you have to have buy-in. You have to have, like, a true understanding of its capabilities, and also the potential risks, to make sure that you have these ethics officers and people in place to ensure that the rollout is exactly what you want.
You're exactly right. And, there are parts of artificial intelligence that are much more mature than others, which is
Hmm.
understandable. For example, from a sales pipeline perspective, we're all familiar with Salesforce. Another example is Pipeliner, where the process is really being modularized and allow you to do analytics on closed sales, on lost sales, on what happened in each one of those circumstances, to archive those things and then come back and get them. So that's really sort of the transactional part of artificial intelligence, providing some insights, particularly around the best practices of the top salespeople, where you look at their closure rates, you look at their behaviors as it goes through the pipeline. But when you start thinking about human behaviors, and you're starting to use virtual reality training to, give your onboarding capabilities. You're looking at, for example, the example you gave around the buyer. If you use the example of the recruiting industry, what they've done is they've gone a long way away from that in-person contact where it might have happened 3 or 4 times throughout the process. It's now happening very much towards the end. And the way that they're doing that is they're filtering resumes, but they're also having robots do the interview process. And what they do is they use artificial intelligence technology to look at your facial features, to listen to your tone, as well as the responses, and actually give you a score when you're finished the interview. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only factor going into that interview, but it's a piece of information that the hiring people will use. And so, if that starts to be applied to a buyer environment or sales training, for example, you have to be very comfortable that what you're doing and how you're doing it is meeting the needs that you were looking for or the objectives you had at the very beginning.
Wow, it's exciting, but it's a little scary as well when you think of where it's going. And I think emotion is so important, but the fact that it can start sensing that, that's that's almost mind blowing a little bit.
So this is one of the things you talked about in terms of the areas that are growing but are at the sort of pioneering edge is around human sentiment and human emotion and empathy and those kind of things. But here's what I would tell you is that the salespeople that I talk to who are using these AI tools believe that they are just that, that
Mhm.
they are information networks, that they can look for best practices, that they can look for articles or recommendations from those engines. But at the end of the day, they're out there talking to their people, human customers. And you use that technology, for example, to assess how your client is doing. Well, maybe they went to the dentist that morning and your typical algorithm is going to suggest that that person is cold and unresponsive and so on, but it just so happens that that's what happened to them that day. So what I would say
Mhm.
is that really good salespeople understand that data is really important, that they are moving into I'm not sure what the appropriate term for it would be, but much more of a virtual conversation, whether it's through web or otherwise. Is that fair to say? I think since the pandemic, the usage of that interaction has gone up by over 80%. And so have that capability. But people that I talk to who are salespeople are saying, I'm looking forward to the day when I get out to see my customer again, and they're looking for ways to make sure that their customers want them to come see them because they become acclimatized to a technology approach. And so, whether that's providing them with trend information or samples or any of the sort of creative ways to get in front of your clients, and then really understand that body language and the tone and what message they're sending to you face to face.
Yeah, it sounds like lots there. It's a catalyst. Like it's still a supporting system, and it helps you filter out things because data, there's a ton of data, but at the end of the day, like it's still up to you. And I think earlier, think about March, April 2020, when lead with empathy was the phrase that everybody's using. That even though we say that some sales reps, some robots probably could have led with better empathy than some of the sales reps, but I think definitely it will get you somewhere, but you still have to carry the torch, beyond. We're humans, and there's things that people are saying when we go back to the face to face, and I don't know if we're going to go fully back. So I think getting used to the technology and seeing it as this is the benefits. I can get a head start with this, so I can start disseminating, filtering things. Then I can use my experience to see what are the next steps. But if I had to do all that, that's a lot of work. So it's almost like, thank you AI for taking something off my plate, but let me run with it now. Let me trust my instincts, my curiosity, the ability to ask provocative questions, share trends. That I still think that it's great, but we have to work in tandem.
Yeah, I would make 2 points about that if I could. One is about you talked about robots and the change in jobs, but to your last point about how you consider or approach automation, a lot of people talk about automation taking away creativity and personalization. Really, you try to scale that process. Truth is, it really allows you to spend more time with the creative ways to sell your products and personalize your offers. Just the routine tasks get delegated to dedicated software. And maybe it's a nudge, maybe it's to do something, or maybe it's recommendation software, or analyzing top salespeople's behaviors, ways to leverage those, but giving yourself more time to do the more important creative aspects and personalizing and customizing to that individual buyer. The second part, I guess I would say, is there have been three industrial revolutions before the current one. And you can kind of characterize them by the steam engine, electricity, and the computer. So those are the sort of three general uh, last industrial revolutions. The fourth one here is certainly about AI. And when you think about all the other industrial revolutions beforehand, every single one of them created more net new jobs. And the reason was because things changed, they evolved into different areas. And so, as people who are listening to this and are thinking about their careers, it becomes even more important for you to think about where jobs are trending to. So, I'm not saying away from sales, I'm saying how are
Mhm.
sales jobs trending? How are they changing? And how are you using those tools? And I guess I would say, Karen, that more tools is not always better. If you have the capability within your organization to integrate some of these tools with, maybe a pipeliner with some of your existing systems, and get the information brought to you in a very comfortable, user efficient way, that's a great dynamic, but not just necessarily more and more and more.
That's really great point because I do see a lot of companies, they're throwing technology at it and they're just a stack after stack. And it's like you're burying the person, but it's too much. And I think when you think about, the email, it's 2 to 3 times the amount of email people are receiving, and then the response rate is down 40%. Well, that's why, because I can tell when a bot's written it. And I like what you said about removing, it's freeing up the time for you as a salesperson to create that personalization and that relevance. And that's what's going to break through the noise. So I would rather have that additional time to really make this message timely, link it to something that you're doing, your company's doing, and really innovate and come up with a creative message. So if you can free up some time to do that tedious work, I'll take the time to make it relevant.
Well, I completely borrow one of your quotes, Karen.
All right.
You talk about before you start pitching your prospects, your product, and its benefits, you need to take a step back, learn how to optimize your sales process by first selling the problem. Those are key aspects of the top sales practices. And that doesn't talk about your automation necessarily, right? It's thinking through that sort of what you call a buyer journey, and doing that active listening that you can't necessarily do within manual data entry or having a bot respond. I use your phrases on that all the time.
Oh, thank you. I'm flattered. And just to build on that, when you think about selling the problem, and even in a discovery, there's upfront contracts, there's specific ways, and there's orders to do that. Like if you're keeping that up to technology to do it, like they're not going to do it, and you're going to sound like that robot that's interrogating your prospect. And I'm just curious, Brian, is there, when you think about technology and the way we use it, do you see a difference in generations? So are millennials using it differently than different generations?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you the real answer after I give you the answer that I'm hearing more. Um, People under the age of 30 are pushing back because emails come to them saying you need to print this to complete X, and people under their 30s are saying you got to understand we don't have printers. They're that situation where we move away from a technology based on generation. Similarly, with you think about the millennials and Gen Zers who are becoming buyers, those people who are more comfortable with a chat than a face-to-face conversation. And so, how do you get past that? one of the examples that I use, and I use this with my 24-year-old son all the time, is he, for example, needs to take his car to some place to get it um, uh, repaired, and he could go on Yelp, he could do get reviews and so on, but knowing the person behind the counter or at the repair shop goes a long way in terms of trust. And that trust capability you really can't define until you actually sort of experience it person to person. And so, even though there are those generational differences where, and there's lots of research where millennials and Gen Zers are much more digital friendly than boomers, for example, or Gen Xers. Um, they are. It really is only part of the solution. You can only get so much data from a review. You really need to have that trust factor, and that comes in with relationships.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As a Gen Xer, I just know, reviews are great and I would do a lot, but you can get the feel and the tone if you actually had a conversation. And just hearing someone's voice. And I think even now, when you think about remote selling and people don't have their cameras on, and the minute they do, there's just this immediate connection. You can see them, you can feel them, and it's just I don't
Yeah.
get why people don't put their cameras on. But
Well, and you know what? From a strictly technology perspective, the amount of data that you're getting from a video versus a voice or text is
mhm.
is exponential. And so we as human beings are really going to continue getting more information out of a visual image.
Absolutely. And I think if you're thinking about from the buyer's journey and trying to, expedite things, like that's going to help just with that video and connecting and seeing them and letting them see you as a person. It's as you said, there's a lot of information to be captured there.
There really is. And I may not sound like the artificial intelligence technology specialist because my origins really come from the business side.
Mhm.
And people would always approach me with some great new technology ideas, but the first questions are all came back down to what's in it for my team, how does this affect our KPIs, how does this relate to our business, can we trust what you're doing, all of those questions.
Yeah. And that's a good segue there, Brian, for KPIs and thinking about sales teams. Sales managers are tasked, they have to meet performance objectives, they have to, coach their teams. So, what role do you see AI playing in that regard? Whether it's, listening to calls, is there, I know your book is on the coaching as well. Is there areas you can share with how sales leaders or managers can leverage AI to support their teams?
Yeah, and the really good sales managers are insisting that the data that's coming to them is integrated so that they don't have to look at multiple different sources of information when they're actually talking to maybe their sales folks. And the quality of it. So, is the user interface that those managers are using, does it illustrate the sales process step by step and not in sort of a dot matrix printer kind of way? Something that's visually pleasing that, a sales manager today, if the sales process is being altered, can use Pipeliner, for example, and just simply point and click and change the sales process, and automatically in the background, the data will flow the way that they want it to. So, having that kind of flexibility for sales managers, and this is only available if you're using artificial intelligence and the ability to sort of think through the process. When they're communicating with their salespeople, what the last thing you want to have is a disagreement on the data. So, are we still talking about the same thing, and that your close rate is not, what it should be? Are you using the same data? And, what about the recommendations that's coming out of this system? Do you agree with those recommendations? Are they truly based on the group that's doing 125% of their quota or more? And what sort of behaviors are they doing? How is the information all being pulled in such a way that you can make reasonable decisions, even though there are 1,000 different factors coming into that conversation? And so sales managers in the best organizations are really relying on AI. An example of that would be Novartis. It's a Swiss pharmaceutical company with a broad group of salespeople who work with the healthcare industries, doctors, and so on. They really rely on artificial intelligence to bring them the data that they need, and whether that's simply how to best schedule your day and the route that you should go on, to the relevancy or the probability of a sale or close with that client.
That's great. And it sounds to me like these sales leaders almost have to do a pre-assessment as to where are their gaps or where are they looking to focus so that it's not all this data. So I think initially knowing your objective or where you want to focus. And then when you get all that information, I think it's really critical. And this is where the human comes in is how do I apply this to my team? Like I have to know my team. I have to know the individual goals as well as the overall team goals, and that allows that connection, like the relatability, how I share that information versus, spitting out this massive document and saying, like, implement this. So I think when you're looking at adoption and successes, that transition where that baton is passed from the AI to the manager and the way in which they communicate that message, I feel just on what you said that that's very important.
Very important. And then, you extend that to the individuals within your team. Some people are great at business development, some are great at closing. So, is the data showing you that? And maybe you're using AI based personality assessments that dig a little deeper into who that individual is. And so that the sales manager is actually saying, hmm, that makes sense. I think we're going to more heavily weight this person towards business development or onboarding. That can be a real challenging issue when you think about new employees to an organization. Maybe they've sold in some other infrastructure, some other place, some other product, but now they have to learn this business. So how quickly can they onboard? And one example is in a different industry in hydro, for example. It's so important that their brand new employees don't risk their lives unnecessarily. So they get opportunities to do virtual reality training. And so, using that virtual reality training, they're approaching those same situations, but without the risk. And they can make the mistakes and then try it over again and try it over and over again. The same thing is true in virtual reality sales training, where you can, apply that sort of sales situation, make all the mistakes, score low, but try again. And so that onboarding becomes new opportunities for sales managers when they use these kind of artificial intelligence tools.
Yeah, I think those are all great examples. And I would imagine that when you're sharing these attributes or, the information that's come out on the individual, that the level of self awareness would most likely increase. You might be sharing something with them about themselves that they weren't really aware of.
Absolutely. I don't know about you, but whenever I go to the doctor's office, my blood pressure goes up. And so, there's a name for that,
Glycogen
white
syndrome.
coat
Yeah.
syndrome or something like that. But, you can imagine the salespeople saying, well, I wasn't really ready. I had didn't really, I wasn't feeling well that day or something like that. Well, you have the opportunity to try it over again, and refine and refine. So it's not that situation where it's once and done or high risk situation putting you in front of a customer. So those are just some opportunities for sales managers to bring people on board or even strengthen skills.
Yeah, and what I think of when you say that is just the synchronous versus the asynchronous learning. And if you think about, the VR, it is synchronous, but it's recorded after. So I think, and I actually do VR training in my programs, but the response that I get was, it's so real, and I think I do role playing as well. And role playing, it still works if it's set up right. I think if your manager is playing the customer, it doesn't work because they're not going to disarm and be vulnerable to try new things on. But when you put them in the VR environment, it's so real that they get nerves, whether it's a practice for a keynote or a discovery, and that they're not practicing in front of their customer. Like that's where you use this trial playground to practice to hone those skills, to even listen back and say, wow, my tone was off there. Or you know what, I cut the like just this is where awareness comes in, but it's also video. Asynchronous can give you that same feedback. It's just, are you taking the time to do it or are you just going into your customer and just spewing all over them?
Well, you're absolutely right. In traditional ways, we could stand up and practice with our colleagues or practice with our manager or whatever, but the amount of feedback that you get from this sort of virtual reality capability, much improved. One of the things I did about 5 years ago when I started getting into artificial intelligence in a real way was um, I read a manual on ER emergency planning, and then I took a virtual reality drive through, if you will, where I was the person who was going to operate on the patient when they reached the emergency room. Well, I got goosebumps. I got adrenaline throughout, and it was so stressful, even though I knew it wasn't real. And so you really do start to get engaged to a much greater extent because the VR, it was from the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, was giving me feedback about the things that I was doing incorrect.
Hmm. That's great. You think about sales training versus surgeons, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of performance there,
A
but
bit of a difference, but of course, to the organization, you look at it and they say, I would love to have my salespeople much more prepared as they approach my customers. So, it's a fascinating time for salespeople to be doing the jobs in the field.
yeah, absolutely. And just shifting along the same plane there, but how would you, or maybe you can talk to us a little bit about conversation analytics. So I know, just being in sales myself, there's still that negative connotation that, they're the used car salespeople, and it's hard to shake that. And I always feel what I use is gong.io. They have predictive analytics. And the reason I really leverage that is because too often people are saying, well, you know what, it should do this. And I think that, and depending on the industry you're in, in healthcare, like I think that could be a death or not a death, right? So I think when you can back it up or support your message with something that's tried and true, it's a lower barrier to entry, and people, that trust level goes up. So when I do sales training and I share like these are the best call to actions, these are the best openers, but I show them this is based off 200,000 calls. It's not just me saying it. All of a sudden that adoption rate goes up. So maybe you can just walk us through a little bit about what you're seeing in conversation analytics, where it's at, where it's going, and how we can benefit from that.
Yeah, one of the examples that I was involved with was around a call center environment. So, here were 3 or 400 call center agents who, in a traditional sense, would be coached by someone, a supervisor, who would take a recorded call, move into their office, listen to the call back, make recommendations, and then have the person go back to the floor. Where we moved to, however, was this conversational intelligence where the individual call agent, while they're on the call, is getting ongoing feedback. So, for example, maybe their pitch is a little higher than they usually are, or maybe they're speaking a little faster than they usually do. And the real time coach will give that feedback. But not only that, it'll actually provide them with ideas in terms of here's what you might say in this situation. Here's the sentiment analysis we're doing on the customer at the time. So what it's doing is it's really informing that call center agent to make some decisions. They don't have to follow it, but they can make some decisions using that conversational intelligence. I think there's, you look at Gong.io, where it not only deals with the individual salesperson, but it looks at deal intelligence as well. So it pulls data from a deal history, but it also looks at market intelligence. So what's happening in the marketplace? And so when you think about a software solution like Gong.io, it's really packaging up a lot of information for you, the sales manager or the sales individual. And I think the other one that I'm aware of is Wingman, where it's much more similar to the call center environment, where you're really coaching that person with extra data. And again, when we started at the very beginning of this podcast talking about AI as a tool, the tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated and mature, um, you know, but the opportunity for salespeople, the top salespeople, to use data in a different way is accelerating.
Yeah, those are great insights, and I think they are sophisticated tools, and I think those who will take that to the next level are those that are going to see those game changing results from a sales rep standpoint. And just what you shared about Gong having the market analysis, the deal, and the sales exactly, that gives you such a wide perspective. Like that's business acumen. So when you're walking and you have that full picture, and a lot of times you're just looking at the sales part, and you're thinking, well, how does that fit into the bigger picture? And without those missing pieces, you just don't have the impact that you can. So I think that's a really great point you brought up. One thing, I have a question. I'm just thinking like deal or coaching conversations, which is great real time because think about now sales managers. I mean, their number one job is to develop their team, but they don't have a lot of time to do that. So if they can get support from technology and then maybe watch the playback and coach to that, it's still adding value. But I'm just wondering the response. So if I'm on a call right now and I get a pop up saying, okay, say this or do that, what is that real time versus giving them feedback after? I'm wondering if they've done studies because I think when you're in the moment and you're looking down and saying, oh, I should have said, I shouldn't say, or, is it distracting? Do you get used to it? Or have you had any feedback on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to do it. When we first introduced it, it was very much, Big Brother is
Hmm.
watching me. There's this sense of every move I make is being analyzed. But quickly, what they found out was, each one of these call center people had quotas or activity or productivity designs of some kind. And so when they started using the software more, they started meeting their goals. And as they started to have conversations amongst their network, they said, yeah, it was kind of intrusive at the beginning, but, I really started to implement some of the things that they've talked about, and I'm getting better results. But then we saw a third stage where people started to say, look, I know I'm already producing, I'm at that level. And so you have a bit of a toggle in the sense that I don't really need to see those ideas anymore. So you can turn certain elements on and off within that software because you're producing. You're already seeing those things. If that's taking away from you, then we really don't need to have that I know that's the right thing to say, for example, or that kind of change. And so we saw significant productivity lifts. We saw their attitude change over time. But the number one thing was about the leader's approach to implementing the technology.
Yeah.
Just like any other. Do people understand the
Hmm.
why and what the benefits are, and how it's going to assist their lives, and how stressful quotas are and productivity measures are. So not only having a management team doing that, but champions, or what I used to call captains within the team, who could actually talk about, hey, you know what, this really worked really well for me last time. So have you tried that? And so just using that sort of human interaction capability to make people feel more comfortable.
Yeah, it sounds like that's the standard change management, and just getting that buy-in initial to get that early adoption and the why behind it. What can you expect? And I think as leaders, if you don't include your team and you don't involve them early on in the phase, like they're going to dig their heels in, right? And I think, as you said, like the way we handle that as leaders, showing them that we're here. This is just how you set up. Because I do coaching calls, I review them, and I hear people coaching their team and there's no setup. There's no this is why we're doing it. This is the purpose. And by sharing that, saying I'm invested in your development and in order to help you achieve your goals, I'm going to be, coaching, observing and giving you feedback. But that right away, just that framework disarms people and lets them know, okay, you're not big brother. You're not here to, micromanage me. You're actually here to support me in my development. So I think if that's missing, I can see why people think, oh, they're watching all the time and it's not a good situation.
Well, Karen, I wish we had you in a bunch of our IT project team meetings, because 70% of AI projects fail. And they don't fail because the technology doesn't work, but they fail because of the people involved in it. And so, the same thing with a project as in, your real time interaction with our clients. It's people, and they're the ones who are going to make it successful or not successful.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Well, it's nice that we're ending on that note that we're not going to be taken over by robots in the sky and all have no jobs. It is they're here to support us, which is great. So, just to recap, Brian, we talked about what AI is, how it can really support our sales team, coaching, looking at conversation analytics. That really leadership takes the role in the systemic, making sure we're looking at the biases that may exist through the data, and adding that human element to it to really filter it out before we roll out whatever it is we're looking to achieve. Now, if there's people that are saying, you know what, we're now we have a background, like I want to start incorporating AI into my company. Like where would they get started? If you could give them two or three tips, where could they get started immediately?
Well, obviously, I would say one of the tips would be to choose one of my books. One of the reasons why I wrote Artificial Intelligence Foundations for Business Leaders was really about that question. If you hear about AI with your friends at the golf course, or you read about it in a newspaper, or your chief technology officer says we should go ahead and do that, what sort of frame of reference do you have to make that decision? And so that's one of the reasons why I wrote Artificial Intelligence Foundations for Business Leaders. One of the other sort of ways to think about it is log on to Salesforce or Pipeliner or Gong.io and look at what's available, and think about it from the integration perspective within your company. What do you have today? What sort of platforms are you using? Where can these new technologies best fit? And I guess the third thing that I would say, Karen, is don't do it all at once. The most successful companies choose a small, important area of their business to apply the AI to, maybe even in a pilot, and then they get that success, and then they move on either by scaling it out or by trying other areas of their business. And by doing that, they start to create some successes, create some champions within the organization, and then they're much more likely to be successful with AI.
I think those are all really good points. So just to recap, so Brian's book gives you a foundational level of where to look at and how to start. Look at your existing tools and integration capabilities so that you know what's possible. And then third, and I love this in terms of change management, it's always create a subset of a group, get buy-in and see those small wins that you can insert that or reposition it into, a larger opportunity and really get the buy-in. And as you said, those champions. So all three great places to get going if anyone's interested in doing that. Well, Brian, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your insights as it relates to AI and the impact it has on sales and their organizations. If people wanted to follow you, what's the best way to do that?
So people can check out my LinkedIn page, Brian Lenahan, BrianLenahan, or they can go to my website, which is AquitaineInnovationAdvisors.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Brian. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.